Alright, so imagine this. You wake up one morning, walk out onto your deck with a cup of coffee, and your brand new neighbor is standing there, arms crossed, staring at your property like she's already decided it doesn't belong to you anymore. Yeah, that was my Tuesday. My name's Daniel Mercer. I'm 51, been doing hardscape and hillside landscaping most of my life, and I've owned my place on this slope just outside Bend, Oregon for over 2 decades now. Long enough to know that gravity doesn't negotiate, and dirt doesn't care about anyone's aesthetic preferences. My property sits higher than the 3 homes below me, not by a little either, about 7 feet, give or take. And back in 2004, when I first bought the place, I built a retaining wall out of treated timber, nothing fancy, about 32 feet long, just under 8 feet tall, ugly as sin but rock solid, and more importantly, it held back roughly 160 cubic yards of soil that would otherwise have a straight shot into my neighbors' living rooms. Nobody complained back then. In fact, the folks downhill thanked me, because their yard stayed flat, their basement stayed dry, and nobody had to think twice every time it rained. Fast forward to last spring, that's when she moved in. Her name was Vanessa Clark, interior designer, Portland transplant, the kind of person who says curated outdoor experience instead of backyard. She buys the house directly below mine, installs this ridiculous glass-edged plunge pool, probably cost more than my first truck, and within 2 weeks, she sends me a certified letter. Not a conversation, not a knock on the door, a letter. I remember opening it right there in my kitchen, thinking it was some HOA newsletter or garbage like that. And instead I'm reading this perfectly formatted complaint telling me my retaining wall was visually disruptive, that it compromised the luxury sight line from her pool deck, and that I was required to replace it with architectural-grade natural stone within 30 days or face daily fines. I actually laughed out loud at first, like, this has to be a joke, right? But no, she was serious. Turns out, she'd just been elected president of the HOA, and apparently that came with a cape and a license to micromanage everyone else's property. So I walked down there the next day, trying to be reasonable, right? I knock on her door. She answers with this tight smile, holding a glass of something expensive looking even though it's barely noon, and before I can even get a word out, she goes, "Oh good, you got my letter," like we're discussing dinner plans. I try explaining, calm, respectful, that the wall isn't decorative, it's structural, it's holding back a massive amount of soil, and changing it isn't just a weekend project. It's engineering, drainage, load distribution, things that don't care about her pool view. She tilts her head, takes a sip, and says, "Well, Daniel, I understand your concern, but the community has standards. And frankly, it's an eyesore." Just like that. No discussion, no curiosity, just a verdict. That's when I knew this wasn't about a wall. This was about control. See, some people move into a place and try to fit in, learn the rhythm of the neighborhood, respect what's already there. And then there are people like Vanessa. People who walk in and immediately start rearranging things like it's their personal showroom. And that letter? That was her way of planting a flag. So I went back home, dug out my old paperwork, survey from when I bought the property, stamped and dated, showing that wall was entirely on my land. Then the original construction permit, signed off by a licensed engineer. Everything clean, everything legal. And just to be extra sure, I hired a geotechnical engineer, cost me about $3,000, to come out and evaluate the slope. Guy spent a full day out there, taking measurements, running calculations, and his final report said it plain as day. Removal of the retaining structure will result in slope instability and probable soil failure. Probable soil failure. That's engineer speak for everything's gonna slide. So I packaged all of that up, survey, permit, engineer's report, and sent it over to Vanessa with a short note, basically saying, "Hey, I get your concern, but removing this wall will cause serious damage, not just to my property, but yours and the neighbors below." Thought maybe, just maybe, she'd take a step back and reconsider. Yeah, no. A week later, I get a response, not from her, but from her attorney. And it's cold, real cold. While the structure may reside on your property, it remains subject to HOA compliance. Failure to remove or replace the wall as directed will result in legal action and financial penalties. That's when it stopped being annoying and started getting interesting. I called my lawyer, explained the situation, and I'll never forget what he said. He chuckled, actually chuckled, and goes, "Daniel, if they want it gone that badly, give them exactly what they're asking for. Just make sure you get that demand in writing." And right there, something clicked. Because up until that point, I'd been thinking like a contractor. Solve the problem, keep the peace. But now I started thinking like someone who'd been backed into a corner and realized the other person had no idea what they were actually asking for. So I wrote back, very politely, asking Vanessa to confirm, clearly, in writing, that the HOA was formally requesting the complete removal of the retaining wall. No replacement yet, just removal. And she did. Oh, she absolutely did. Signed, dated, stamped. Gave me exactly what I needed. And that's when I made my decision. Not out of anger, not even out of spite, honestly. Just compliance. Pure, simple compliance. If she wanted the wall gone, then the wall was coming down. All right, before we get to what happened next, because trust me, it gets a lot worse, I want to break something down real quick, because this is where most people completely misunderstand how HOA power and human behavior actually works. All right, pause the story for a second, because this right here, this is where things get real interesting, and honestly, this is the part most people completely miss when they deal with HOAs, or people like Vanessa. According to standard procedure, HOAs do have authority over aesthetic guidelines, paint colors, fencing styles, landscaping choices, that kind of thing. But that authority has limits, especially when you're dealing with something structural. And that's the key word here, structural. From a legal perspective, once a structure is tied to safety, drainage, or soil stability, you're no longer just arguing about appearances. You're stepping into liability territory. And liability? That's where things get expensive real fast. Now here's the part that makes this situation a textbook case. Vanessa made a critical mistake. She didn't just complain, she formalized the demand. She put it in writing, through legal counsel, after being presented with an engineer's report that clearly warned about the consequences. That changes everything. Because now, if something goes wrong after compliance, responsibility doesn't just magically fall back on the homeowner. It can shift toward the party that enforced the action despite known risks. And psychologically, this is a classic power escalation scenario. This is a psychological trap. When someone gains a little authority, especially in a new environment, they feel this pressure to assert control, to prove legitimacy. Backing down, even when presented with evidence, feels like losing. So instead, they double down. They ignore inconvenient facts, rely on rules as shields, and convince themselves they're in the right because technically, they have authority. But here's the catch. Authority without understanding is dangerous, especially when you're dealing with things like gravity, water, and soil. Those don't care about HOA bylaws. They don't negotiate. They don't compromise. And Daniel, he understood that. He stopped arguing. He stopped resisting. And instead, he complied. Completely. Now let's get back to what happened next, because this is where compliance turns into consequence. So, September 18th, I wake up early, sky's clear, air's got that dry late summer feel. You wouldn't think anything bad could happen on a day like that. I grab my coffee, make a couple calls, and by 9 a.m., there's an excavator parked in my driveway. Not a small one either. I went with something that could do the job clean and fast, because if I was going to comply, I wasn't going to drag it out. No drama, no hesitation, just execution. Around 10, I walk the machine over to the edge of the wall, take a second, just standing there, looking at it. That wall had been there almost 20 years, held through storms, heavy winters, everything Oregon could throw at it. And I knew exactly what it was doing every second it stood there, holding back pressure, redirecting water, keeping that slope stable. But hey, HOA said it had to go. First timber came out with a loud crack, deep, splintering sound that echoed down the slope. And almost immediately, you could see it. The soil behind it shifted, just a little, like it was stretching after being held in place for years. Not collapsing yet, just moving, breathing. About an hour in, I notice movement down below. Vanessa's out on her deck. Sunglasses on, leaning against the railing, holding a glass of white wine like she's watching a live renovation show. And then, this is the part that still gets me. She raises her glass and gives me a little wave. Like we're celebrating. I actually laughed. Not angry. Not even surprised anymore. Just one of those moments where you realize someone has absolutely no idea what they're looking at. I waved back, finished the job. 6 hours later, that wall was gone. Every timber pulled, every anchor removed. What used to be a solid retaining structure was now just a bare slope of compacted soil, exposed to the elements for the first time in 2 decades. And here's the thing. If you don't understand hillside physics, it might look fine at first. Nothing dramatic happens right away. The ground just sits there, quiet. But underneath, pressure's building. Moisture starts creeping in. The balance is already gone. You just haven't seen the result yet. So I parked the excavator, went inside, and waited. 5 days later, the rain started. Now, if you've lived in Oregon, you know the kind of rain I'm talking about. Not a light drizzle, not something polite. I'm talking steady, relentless, soaking rain. That year, we got hit hard early in the season, over 6 inches in less than 48 hours. And every drop of that water was doing exactly what the engineer warned about, seeping into that exposed slope, adding weight, reducing friction, turning packed soil into something unstable. By the second night, I could feel it in the air, that heaviness, that tension. Around 1:50 a.m., I wake up. Not sure why at first, just this low vibration I can feel more than hear. Then it hits. A deep, rolling sound, like thunder, but sustained, like a freight train dragging itself through mud. The kind of sound that doesn't just pass by, it builds. And I knew immediately what it was. I got out of bed, walked to the window, and even in the dark, you could see it, the entire slope shifting. Not fast at first, slow, almost graceful, but then it picked up speed. And once it starts, there's no stopping it. That mass of soil, about 160 cubic yards, just let go. It slid straight down the hill, carrying everything in its path. By the time it hit Vanessa's property, it wasn't just dirt anymore. It was a full-on mud flow. It smashed through her poolside fence like it wasn't even there, poured into that pristine infinity pool she loved so much, filled it with nearly 4 feet of thick, heavy mud. Pumps, filters, electrical systems, fried. Completely. But it didn't stop there. The slide kept going, spilled into the next property, flooded their basement, cracked part of their foundation. Then the house below that, same story. Water, mud, damage stacking up in minutes. And the whole time, that sound, that low, grinding rumble, just kept echoing through the night. Then silence. The kind of silence that only comes after something irreversible. About 20 minutes later, my phone starts ringing. First one call, then another, then another. I already knew who it was before I even looked. I let it ring once, twice, then picked up. And yeah, she was screaming. Not talking, not asking, screaming. Words tumbling over each other. Panic, anger, disbelief. What did you do? My pool is destroyed. The whole hillside collapsed. Like somehow this was a surprise. Like none of this had been explained, clearly, professionally, with documentation. So I waited. Let her finish. Then I said, calm as I could, Vanessa, you asked for the wall to be removed. You put it in writing. And I sent you an engineer's report explaining exactly what would happen if I did. Dead silence on the line. Not long, just a few seconds. But enough. By morning, the damage was undeniable. Emergency crews showed up, inspectors walked the properties, insurance adjusters started taking notes. For separate households filed claims. Total damage came out somewhere around $120,000, and Vanessa's pool alone? Close to $80,000 to repair, maybe more once they dug into the electrical. And here's where it all comes together. My attorney stepped in that afternoon, sent a formal letter. Not aggressive, not emotional, just facts. We made it clear. I was willing to rebuild the retaining wall immediately, restore slope stability, prevent further damage. But the cost? That wasn't on me. Because this wasn't negligence. This was compliance. Compliance with a formally documented HOA demand, issued after a professional warning had been provided and ignored. From a legal standpoint, that matters. A lot. We proposed terms, $13,000 to reconstruct the wall properly, plus a long-term maintenance agreement funded through the HOA. Nothing outrageous, just enough to ensure the structure would be monitored and maintained so this never happened again. And one clause, my favorite clause, if payment was delayed beyond 30 days, I reserved the right to remove the wall again. You should have seen how fast things moved after that. Vanessa resigned from her HOA position within 3 weeks. No announcement, no goodbye, just gone. The board approved the agreement not long after, probably because they realized fighting it would only make things worse. And by mid-November, that wall was back. Same design, same eyesore, same function. Only difference now? Everyone understood exactly why it was there. And every year since then, like clockwork, a check shows up for maintenance. Signed, by Vanessa. So, what's the takeaway from all this? Because yeah, it's a wild story, it's got drama, a little bit of karma, maybe even feels satisfying depending on how you look at it. But underneath all that, there's something a lot more practical going on here. The lesson here is, not all rules are created equal, and not all authority understands the consequences of what it's enforcing. According to standard procedure, HOAs are supposed to protect property values, maintain visual consistency, keep neighborhoods desirable, and in theory, that makes sense. Nobody wants to live next to a collapsing fence or a yard that looks abandoned. But the problem starts when those guidelines get applied without context, when aesthetics start overriding function. Because once you cross that line, you're no longer improving a neighborhood, you're putting it at risk. From a legal perspective, what saved Daniel, what made this whole situation turn in his favor, was documentation and restraint. He didn't argue endlessly, didn't escalate emotionally, didn't go rogue. He gathered evidence, brought in a professional, issued a clear warning, and most importantly, he got the demand in writing. That's the part people skip. They assume being right is enough. It's not. Being able to prove you were right before something went wrong, that's what matters. And then there's the human side of it. This is a psychological trap a lot of people fall into, especially when they're given a little authority for the first time. There's this urge to justify your position, to prove you're effective, to show you can make changes. And once you've made a demand publicly, backing down starts to feel like weakness. So instead of reassessing, people double down. They ignore new information, dismiss expert opinions, and convince themselves that enforcing the rule is more important than understanding it. Vanessa didn't set out to cause damage. I don't believe that. What she wanted was control and a better view. But she underestimated something fundamental. Systems that already exist usually exist for a reason, especially when they've been quietly doing their job for years without complaint. And here's the part most people don't like to hear. Compliance can be more powerful than resistance. When someone pushes you into a corner with rules, sometimes the smartest move isn't to fight. It's to follow those rules exactly as written and let reality handle the rest. Because reality doesn't bend. Gravity doesn't care about HOA bylaws. Water doesn't care about design preferences. And consequences? They don't negotiate. Now, that doesn't mean you go looking for ways to prove people wrong or set them up to fail. That's not the point. The point is understanding the system you're in, knowing your rights, and recognizing when someone else is overstepping without fully grasping the impact of their decisions. So if you're dealing with an HOA or any kind of authority structure, really, ask questions. Get things documented. Bring in experts when needed. And if something doesn't feel right, don't just assume it'll work itself out. Because sometimes it won't. And sometimes it'll slide. All right, I'm curious now. What's the worst HOA situation you've ever seen or dealt with? Drop it in the comments. I read more of those than you'd think.